In this video, we're going to be learning about else-if statements and the concept of a bigger if block. Technically, we've already seen an if block whenever we use an if-else statement, if and then an else, that is a bigger if block. But once you start adding elifs in there, the block can get kind of much bigger, and really formalizing the idea of what an if block is, I think, is important now that we have else-if statements in there. So what we have right here is a program that I just drew two lines, and then on mouse press, anytime the mouse is clicked, I will draw a circle, or maybe a star, or maybe a regular polygon with three sides, meaning I'm making a triangle. And depending on where my mouse coordinates are, I'll decide using my if statements to, if the mouse y is less than 200, I'll make it a circle. Or if the mouse x is less than 200, I'll make it a star. Or if the mouse x is greater than 200, I'll make that triangle. So let's take a quick look at this and see how it runs. I guess I can just zoom out a little bit. And over here, you'll notice the star and the triangle zones, those are working a-okay. Every time I click, my mouse x is less than 200, so I made a star. My mouse x was greater than 200, so I made a triangle. The issue becomes when I'm still checking in those other if statements if my mouse x is greater than or less than 200. So even though now my mouse y, right, it's 0 to 400 for my y, 0, 0 in the top left. My mouse y is less than 200, but because my mouse x is also less than 200, it makes a star. My mouse y is less than 200, but because my mouse x is also bigger than 200, it'll make a circle and then a triangle. And this is where the power of else-if statements come into play and the idea of a bigger if block. So let's take a quick look at this code. And you'll notice that, all right, my first if statement checks if my y is less than 200, and if it is, I'll make that circle. But then, well, I just keep moving on, right? I check this if statement. If my mouse x is less than 200, then I'll also make a star, which is how we ended up with this circle and then a star on top of it over here. If that was false, my mouse is not less than 200, but instead it's greater than 200, like here where my x was 283 and my y was 58, I'll make the circle and then I'll also make the triangle. Now, using just ifs, it would be really hard to make a circle only zone up over here. But with the power of elifs, we're going to be able to have a circle only zone up here. Now, before, like we just saw, when you have an if statement, it'll check if this is true or false, this condition. And if it's true, I'll run it. Otherwise, I will skip it. And then I move on to the next line of code, which is another if block. We do the same thing. If I want to really check between multiple different things and only do one of them, this is where we need to have the power of the elif. So what I'm going to do right now is just type in el, which turns this from an if to an elif, which you really would say is like an else if. And there's a really big thing happening over here. An elif works identically to an if. It still requires a condition. It's still going to check if it's true or false, and it's still going to do this, whatever code's inside of it, if its condition is true. But the big difference is you're never allowed to start an elif all by itself. I am not allowed to start with an elif over here. I will get an error. What an elif is, it's a second condition to check after a first if. I always need to start with an if I want to check something. And what an elif does is it takes these two conditions and it kind of smushes them together in what we call a bigger if block. And now lines 5 through 8, 5, 6, 7, and 8, they're all connected in this one big if block instead of two separate if statements. And what that does for us now is, what an if to an elif does is you treat your first if like normal. You check, is this condition true? If it's not true, we just skip, right? If my mouse y, let me run it again. If my mouse y is not less than 200, it's down here, we just do the same old thing. Everything works like normal. If my mouse y is not less than 200, or if it's greater than 200, this condition is false. So I skip the next line, I check my elif. And then if the elif is true, I'll do it. If it's not, I won't, right? Same exact thing. The difference is because this if and elif, they're connected together in a block, since I called it an else if, that's how you connect them together. Now, only one of them can ever run, which means, let's see what happens. If I run my code, my mouse Y is less than 200, I'll create this circle, but then because this is an else if and it's in the same block, it would skip everything left in that if block. The idea of an if block, sorry if I'm being a little confusing, let me just kind of reset myself here for a second. The idea of an if block is that as soon as one of my conditions comes up true and I run that if or elif, once I'm done running that code, I skip the rest of the block. And what this allows us to do now is, if my mouse Y was less than 200, I'll only draw the circle and I'll skip that star part. If my mouse Y up here is less than 200, I'll only draw the circle, I'll skip the star part. Notice though that this second if, it's a new if, it's not an elif. So what's going to happen is if I go over here where my Y is less than 200 but my X is greater than 200, I'll create the circle, I'll skip that star part because I already did one part of my if block, but because I wrote a brand new if again here, it's just going to check it. It's not part of the same block. I will still continue to check it. And that's why we create this circle with a triangle in it. If I wanted to fix that part, well, all I need to do is just combine my triangle part into the larger if block that we have here by turning it into another elif. And now all three of these conditions are combined together into one really big if block. So now what happens is I'll check if my mouse Y is less than 200. If it is, I'll create the circle, but then because they're all one part of one big if block, I'll skip lines 7 and 8, lines 9 and 10, and then it looks like we're done with this function, done with this program over here. Let's say my mouse Y was not less than 200. Well, I would then go check this second elif, and I could say, hey, if the mouse X is less than 200, I'll create a star. If it was less than 200, I'll create the star, and then I skip everything else that's below it. So the whole idea is that these elifs let you connect multiple ifs together so that only one of them will run, which is important in the case where I've got something like this, where I want a circles only zone, no matter where I have my mouse X, but then I also want to have a star only and a triangle only zone. There's a lot more that could be said about ifs and elifs and how they can be put together. One thing that's really important to note is it always checks from top to bottom, just like how everything runs from top to bottom unless you have a function or an if statement, of course. So you could potentially put yourself in a situation where you're creating some code that can never be reached. Let me show you. For example, what if I do an elif over here and I check to see if my mouse X is less than 50? And if it's less than 50, I'll make a rectangle at my mouse X, mouse Y, and let's make it, I don't know, like 30 by 30. I can run this, but I will never make a rectangle, even if my mouse X is less than 50. And that's because, well, the elif higher up, the elif right above it, is checking if my mouse X is less than 200. If it's less than 200, I'll create my star, and then I skip everything else below it. And this is an issue because on line 9, I wanted to check if it's less than 50. But since I'm checking if I'm less than 200 first, 50 is less than 200, or 45 is less than 200, this piece of code I will never reach. So be careful with your elifs because they let you skip things below it without ever checking them. You might create a little error there. So you just want to make sure, all right, if I want to have this, I can make it work. Just make sure that it goes above that one. Just a little kind of word of warning. There is a lot more that can go wrong with elifs and a lot more that you can do with if and then elif inside of it and then an else and then maybe another if statement below all of that. There's tons that you can do with these if statements. But just trying to give like a little bit of help. Notice even though my mouse X is definitely less than 50 over here, it's only creating the blue circles. That's because all of these are one big block. And since I start checking my mouse Y first, if I make the circle, I skip everything else. But now that we have the mouse X less than 50 before the mouse X less than 200, I can go ahead and create a rectangle over here, right? My mouse X is less than 50, so it'll make that. But then once I go over here, well, it's not less than 50, so we'd skip line 7 and line 8. And then it is less than 200, so I'll make the star. And so I hope that gave a little bit of an idea of the difference between if and elif, right? Again, if I just do this as all ifs, they're no longer a part of one big if block. I will check each and every single one of these, no matter which one is run. The big difference between if after if after if versus if with elifs below it attached to that if in a big if block is if after if after if, it will create every single, let me make this rectangle a little bit bigger, it will check every single one of those conditions no matter whether or not it's been run. So that way I can have a circle with a star, a circle with a triangle, or maybe both a rectangle and a star will get created over here, or even the circle, star, and rectangle are all going to get made. If I don't want that happening, I have to tell it, I only ever want you to run one of these, and I tell my program that by saying, we're going to connect these into one big if block that's all connected by attaching them as else ifs. And now, whichever one checks correct first, whichever one of these conditions comes out true first, it'll run that one, and only that one, it skips the rest. So now that we have the elifs, again, we got our blue circles and only our triangles, or even just only our rectangles. Same thing goes for else, right? If I put an else over here, like else, and then maybe make a, whatever, rectangle, maybe just a circle at mouse X, mouse Y, and then 20. The else only runs if everything else above it is not true. And if I like kind of finagle myself to have an X coordinate exactly on 200, this will make that black circle, right? Because I was checking if I was strictly less than 200 or strictly greater than 200. That's the only case that this else would show up. But otherwise, only one of these things will ever run. So I hope that gave you an idea. This is one big if block over here. I guess I could show one other example. Maybe if I did something like this, now I have two bigger if blocks, right? Here's one if-elif block, and here's an if-elif else block. So these two will run separately, right? I'll check whichever one of these two. Well, if this one is true, this will run first. And then if it's not true, I'll check this and run that if you know my mouse X happens to be less than 50. Then no matter what, I will be checking this because I will be checking line 10 because it's part of its own if block. Turn it into an elif. Now all of a sudden they're all attached. Only one of these will ever run. I think I've said that about 8 times. I really hope that this is clear and that we understand, you know, how elifs are useful and how powerful they can be. They let you look at a bunch of conditions and going from top to bottom, only one of them will run. All right. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time.